everyone. My name's Neelam Khosla-Stevens. I work as a higher education consultant. I've been asked to say a couple of words on anti-racism, and I'm going to do so in the context of work. For me, anti-racism exists in an organisation when people are active in challenging perceived racist behaviour or procedures or systems, and also equally where the leaders of that organisation understand and promote an anti-racist culture, where one feels free to champion equal but different without any fear of repercussion.
Morning, welcome to Anti-Racism in Action Season 2, Episode 3. This episode is all around London. My name's Gavin O'Mara. I'm the CEO and founder of Ep3 News. And Nino, thanks for an absolutely brilliant opener to today's show. We've got a really, really interesting episode today, a really important one. You know, London is the capital city of the UK. We have also got some real systemic sort of changes which need to be made. I'm joined by Robin Lamb, and Robin's joining us from across the world, actually. So hopefully connection's all going to be good. Got two really absolutely outstanding guests. We've got David Russell from ETF, and we've got Andy Forbes from BFELG. Maybe to set the scene a bit, because there's a lot of things which to take into account with regards to London. It's a global city. It's the largest capital city in England and the UK. Largest urban economy when compared to cities in Europe as well. And in 2019, the gross regional product was 503 billion. That's a quarter of the UK's GDP. So London's incredibly significant. It's the most ethnically diverse than any city or town in the UK. There's 9 million people in London. 40% of Londoners are black. But we were just talking before the show that 50% of black people live in London. It's an incredible amount of diversity within London. It's so a melting pot of the world. It's often regarded as. Over 300 languages are spoken in London. But this is all the good stuff and all the opportunity. But there's also the flip side. There's an ethnicity pay gap in London. It's 24%. That's double to the next highest region, which is Yorkshire and Humber. ONS figures literally from yesterday highlighted nationwide that black and ethnic minority unemployment rates are still twice as bad as rates for white workers. We're seeing that in London as well. The rates of poverty in London are higher than any other region in the UK. If you've lived in London, you will see the disparity. Ep3 News was set up in Tower Hamlets, one of the largest disparities in poverty in the UK. Interesting points around attainment of students. London is higher than any other region in the UK at level 3 and improving. Yet only 44% of African and Caribbean HE students gained a place at high-ranked universities, compared to 86% of white students. There's significant underrepresentation of Asian population in apprenticeships, which we've seen across the board. And representations of black students in primary, secondary, post-16 HE is increasing significantly. Like the student population is going to soon be over 70%, but this isn't reflected in staff leadership and governance. So there's only 12% of CEOs are black, 9% of chairs of governors in colleges, 21% of lecturers, 13% of professors, and other senior HE leaders. That's pretty alarming. So today is all going to be around looking at the opportunities, but also the challenges. What can we do? I wonder if I could introduce in Robin, who I can see, which is fantastic. Robin, I wonder if you could join me in the studio. Oh, we got I can't see you anymore, Robin. I'm sorry. I might have to drop you out and hopefully we can get a better connection. Robin is joining us from Dubai, which shows the international status of what we're doing today. But I think maybe the Wi-Fi is letting us down a bit. Robin, I'm just going to pull you out and hopefully you can have a better connection shortly. Leah, I wonder. Yeah, thank you. I wonder if I could actually invite in my guest, David Russell from ETF, Andy Forbes from BFELG. Hi guys, how are you?
Very well, thank you. Yeah, good to be here.
And And sorry about Robin. Hopefully he can join us again really soon. I'll see if I can bring him back in. Otherwise, you just got me today as your host. Um, uh, what would you see to be the opportunities and challenges for London? I mean, those figures are really stark. Also, this shows at a really interesting time of what's happening in London as well, with like changes in the Metropolitan Police, NHS going through a great big review, not being funny. The Metropolitan Police are talking about systemic racism in the Met. When I don't know, I'm 45. We were talking about that before I was born. And it's like, how can we progress beyond just talking about this and actually make changes which can make a difference? Andy, I wonder if you could like kick us off with what opportunities we've got now with coming at this next stage of the pandemic, this next stage of where we're at with London.
Yeah, it's London is fascinating, isn't it? It's such a paradox. And I was reading the Levelling Up white paper that's just come out, which was talking about what a fantastic country Britain is, but the opportunities are not distributed equally across the country, and we need to do something about it. And London's like a microcosm. What a fantastic city! As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not a Londoner, but I've been principal of 2 colleges in London, in Tottenham and Islington, and I got to know London very well. What a fantastic city, but what a contrast between the haves and the have-nots, if you like, in London. And I think that's the paradox that we're faced with, is that there are so many success stories about people from black backgrounds in London, and yet side by side with that, there are so many stories which are just the opposite. And we just seem to have got stuck in London with not moving forward the anti-racist agenda. And that really it's a strange paradox in a city which, as you say, Gavin, is so diverse, so exciting, should be leading the way. Unfortunately, it isn't.
And it's a strange one, isn't it? I mean, you can probably tell by my accent. I do come from London. I come from Enfield, so you probably know exactly where I'm from, Andy. And it's this. It's very unusual, isn't it? As to, like you're saying, it's so 300 different languages spoken in the same city. That's massive. Half of the black population of the UK lives in London. What's that about? David, what do you sort of see the opportunities to be, and then how can we sort of address those?
Yeah, they are remarkable stats, aren't they? And I think one of the things they bring out is just how skewed our country is, kind of economically, politically. It's very unusual to have kind of one city that really dominates the whole country. Most European countries are not set up like that. The political capital is not necessarily the economic capital, not necessarily the cultural capital. Whereas in the UK, it's all London, isn't it? Really, and we really struggle with that kind of centre of gravity. And almost all our national institutions are based in London, and yet you wouldn't always know it. So, I was in the civil service for 16 years. The ethnic makeup of the department I was in, the Department for Education, just about represented the ethnic mix of England, didn't at all reflect the mix of London, where most of it was based. And that picture got a bit worse as you kind of went up into the senior civil service. So there's definitely some kind of baked in problems, I think, because London is also representing the whole country as well as representing itself. And those two things, I think, can sometimes act in tension a bit. I think the other interesting thing that's changed right now is that we're seeing that representation at most senior levels doesn't in and of itself fix the problem.
Yep.
So it used to be, as soon as we would talk about diversity or anti-racism, one of the early things someone would say in a conversation is, well, look at who runs this country. They're completely unrepresentative. They're all white. Mostly men. Whatever. Not true anymore. You look at the cabinet now. 2 of the 4 great offices of state not held by white people. There's a really strong kind of spread across the cabinet of minority ethnic leaders, and yet my colleagues say to me, well, yeah, but that doesn't mean anything's fixed. And indeed, Robin, who hopefully will join us, said to me quite recently, it's not about the colour of your skin, it's about what's in your heart. And I thought, well, that's a very powerful phrase, but it also moves the conversation on from, representation will fix it. You talked about the Met Police. I have no particular insight into the Met Police, but as well as racism, there's really clear stories about misogyny, and yet it's been led by a woman. So I think the conversation is moving on to representation rather than representation, and that's more challenging. But I'll pause for a sec.
Yeah, no worries. I want to try. Yeah, go for it, Andy. I was going to try to bring Robin in.
That's a really interesting point. I totally agree with it in principle, but I have to say that when you look at the FE sector in London, composition of senior post holders, and for that matter, you look at the school sector and the university sector, there is still an underrepresentation, a chronic underrepresentation of black professionals, women. Bit better, but there are still issues. But I do agree, representation in itself is not the answer. And I've got a feeling that in some ways, the enormous diversity of London, the fact that you can travel around London and see people of so many different backgrounds mingling, peacefully, getting on with their lives, etc., can breed a sort of complacency that somehow the fact that London is so diverse in itself will deal with racism. And I think the lesson is, no, you have to actually do something active. You can't just imagine that by being diverse, that will somehow tackle the issues. It's a bit similar to thinking that by putting boys and girls together, sexism will somehow automatically disappear. It's just not going to happen. And we need some really positive policy and action points to move the agenda along.
Yeah,
in my opinion.
I'm going to try to bring Robin in one more time, and then hopefully he can connect. I can't see him, but hopefully, Robin, can you hear us by audio only? Are you able to join us that way? Sorry, I think we've still got a bit of a problem. Leah, maybe if you could drop Robin back. Yeah. Sorry, Robin, we tried. We're live, so this is the one of the perils of it. I think you've got a really interesting point there, Andy, around mixing boys and girls doesn't fix problems around sort of sexism and misogyny and all of this sort of stuff. But I don't have the answer to that problem. I don't have the answer to how we can sort of fix systemic racism in the FE sector. I mean, I asked AOC just before the show, just looking at colleges. The FE sector is an ecosystem, so this is just colleges. There's 32 in London, so you think that's as a microcosm, that's only 32 organisations to look at to be able to look to drive change. And are there ways and processes which need to be in place to try to deliver that? Also we need to also be thinking obviously of training providers, awarding organisations, and then suppliers within the sector, and then educators and the such. But I think it's all of these things is chunking it down. How can we sort of help break this down, really? I mean, ONS figures yesterday I thought was interesting, where the world of work has changed in what employers are thinking. The way we're working is changing. London is very, like you said, David, very place-based, but the nation and the world of work is changing. Like there's roles now where you had to be in London, where now you could be anywhere in the country. And I think that leveling up is interesting around what's happening with that. Does that give an opportunity, particularly when you look at some of those stats on ONS around it's high amounts of unemployment for black community, but also if we was to look at educators in the sector around dual professionalism, and I know you're not going to put ETF on hat on today, David, but is there an opportunity there for us to be able to then address, if we was looking at London as a microcosm of this, where we could get people to be able to bring them in from like the most senior activity for over 50s that we've ever seen, also around sort of adding diversity into the education sort of sector to try to level up what we've got as diversity? What sort of opportunities does this stage of the pandemic, does this stage of the future of work, the great resignation, the great reshuffle, does it give us a new opportunity to be able to try to address this? David?
Big question. I mean, a couple of thoughts. I mean, the first one is, I'd just be kind of wary of what it means, those stats about over 50s being economically inactive. I would want to understand why that was. The baby boomer generation is the richest generation this country has ever seen. And that's a gold medal that will probably never be taken away from them, because the generation that comes after them will not equal them in disposable income. So I wouldn't be surprised if, a large part of that is about people who are not working because they don't need to be working. It's some people don't like me saying this, but it's a generation that had it both ways. They had state support from, NHS, free higher education, all this kind of thing, and they benefited hugely from the housing boom and all that sort of thing. So I'm just a bit wary of that kind of over 50s thing, Gavin, but Andy might sort of have a different angle on that. As for the pandemic and well, you can work anywhere. Again, I'd be really wary about that, because generally this sort of facilitation will help the haves, not the have-nots. So one of the big issues we saw through the pandemic was digital poverty and the digital divide. Even when colleges did a fantastic job of both deploying kit and deploying skills and turning on a sixpence in terms of online delivery, the biggest issue was people at home accessing on very limited data, for example, or trying to work on a handheld device, or not having the space at home for being able to work and all that kind of thing. So I think the opportunities are probably not very well aligned with improving diversity, and certainly I don't quite see the anti-racism link myself, but maybe I'm missing something, Andy.
Well, no, I share some of your reservations about it, but there's no doubt that, I think there is a pool potentially of people who could come into FE, and we desperately need. We need more role models. We need more visible, black professionals doing things. So I think it's a good idea to look at alongside other things. But there are issues with it, because, of course, there are all sorts of stories behind why people over 50 have ended up in the situation they're in. And the other big point for me is that for some reason, the further education sector has not got a high enough profile in terms of being seen by ambitious black people of any age as being a place where you can get a great job and a career. Now, there's been a recent campaign from the Department for Education. The government's trying to promote it, but we need much more to get across the opportunities that there are for people working in the further education sector. And I think that's a crucial thing we need to keep pressing on.
That's a great point. I really agree with that, Gavin. And I think there's an interesting angle here, which is that when you're disadvantaged in the labour market, and you had some powerful stats at the beginning about this, when you're disadvantaged in the labour market, one of your strategies for mitigating that disadvantage is to shore yourself up with qualifications and professional status. And so the fact that the further education teaching profession doesn't have mandatory qualifications, doesn't have mandatory professional status, doesn't have mandatory professional standards, as well as the other pernicious effects of that, I think it is possibly exacerbating the lack of representation, coming through. And Andy's point about, is it an attractive career proposition? So I think it's, professionalism, professional status, professional qualifications are really, really important part of the proposition to bring a wider range of people and a new talent into the sector. And the ETF does a lot of work in that area, and we promote it as hard as we can, and we'd like to see more of that.
Yeah, I was only talking to that department in DFE yesterday around teaching recruitment and looking at particularly dual professionalism. That's why I was sort of touching on the 50 plus, because they've already had their career and then they can move into how can we do that for London? I think David, you touched on a really interesting point actually, and Andy, I really want to start off this with you really. With the stats we talked about earlier, there's a high proportion of black young people, particularly in London, going to university, and it's then looking at ONS figures, looking at other figures, then struggling to convert that into roles, into starting off their professional career, FE, banking, any sector. How do we fix that, Andy? What's the way forward with that? Because that's starting at grassroots level, but also how do you then progress to be able to then have representation in colleges, in training providers, in universities, schools?
Yeah.
How do we fix this?
I think there's a very particular point around, which is not just for black students, but for everybody, particularly black students, which is that colleges focus, and we're forced to focus by government policy on the numbers of people passing qualifications. But quite often, it's not the qualifications alone that are going to open the doors in terms of getting into a job. It's what, I don't like the phrase soft skills, but it's employability skills. It's the culture of work as well that needs to be worked on. And that's where people from a more advantaged background have they have the advantage of having parents who network with professionals, knowing how to conduct yourself in at dinner times and things like that. And I think there's a lot more work that we need to do. I remember very clearly, we had a scheme when I was at Tottenham. Well, and you could see from Tottenham, by the way, you could see the gleaming spires of the City of London. It seemed like miles away, although it was only about 3 miles away. And we had an apprenticeship accountancy scheme, which was getting young people from, very modest backgrounds, if you like, into accountancy apprenticeships with some of the big companies. And we had a really great charity partner, etc., who was working with us to do that. But to cut a long story short, I had to deal with an issue where one of them was, the feedback was they were antisocial, they weren't a good team player. What's the matter with this young man, a young Asian lad? I had a chat with him. It turned out that, what was happening was that at lunchtime, they would say, oh, let's go out and have a bite to eat. But he was finding that they were spending 20, 30 pounds on lunch that he couldn't afford. So he said no, went to the toilet and had his, sandwich in the toilet. And that was being seen as somehow he wasn't a team player. In fact, he was actually feeling embarrassed that he just couldn't afford to the lifestyle that was around him that everybody else was taking for granted. Now, none of those people were necessarily deliberately making him uncomfortable. They just hadn't thought through what it's like for somebody in Canary Wharf who's from a poor background to be invited out for a 20 quid lunch. I mean, that 20 quid is the whole week's lunch, one day. So it's those sorts of things. How you coach people to deal with those situations, how you talk to employers about taking into account the background of apprentices and other trainees. Those are the sorts of things we need to be doing a lot more of, in my opinion, so that we can actually tackle the gap between qualification and getting into a really good job. And I think the point's already been raised that I don't think there's any problem in black communities with people being very positive about getting qualifications. In fact, I've seen people with 2 PhDs, 3 degrees, etc. But that in itself, as I say, isn't enough. We need to focus on that employability bit, particularly with black professionals, because of the statistics are terrible. And the pandemic's made it worse, by the way. Black graduates are not getting jobs in the same way as white graduates. The figures are really quite distressing as to the lack of opportunity that's opening up for some of the black graduates with perfectly good degrees. Maybe it's that employability bit that needs to be worked on.
Yeah, no, definitely. I wonder if I could bring in Robin. Is just put a note over. He can't join us because of Wi-Fi, but he said we need role models. We need acknowledgement and ownership by gatekeepers of their role and underrepresentation and their responsibility in changing the status quo. So basically, it's backing up exactly what you said there, Andy. Around we need role models to be able to help, enable really. And I 100% agree. Being an Enfield boy and also going over to Canary Wharf as well, I understand the difference between that 20 quid for a lunch and just not affording it at all. I totally get that. That's the one of the challenges of London, isn't it? Is that you can have, living in Tower Hamlets on the Isle of Dogs, I used to live, that you just see such diversity in vehicle in a car park, let alone everything else that's going on. It's just a very interesting city and interesting time. David, I wonder if we could explore around what you're saying as well around sort of that progression route really, and employability.
I mean, I very much agree with what Andy's talking about, but in an attempt to kind of introduce a little bit of disagreement, I would say what you're really talking about, Andy, is social capital, and the story you've just told is about negative impact on someone who is poor or comparatively poor, and it's not specifically about racism and anti-racism. So obviously there's overlap, there's intercontextuality and all that. But Robin's point, I think, really resonates for me. We need role models, but we need acknowledgement and ownership by gatekeepers of their role in underrepresentation and their responsibility in changing the status quo. And this is kind of very much where I'm at now. I have no particular insight into racism or anti-racism, neither academic insight nor personal lived experience. I mean, I've never been on the receiving end of racism, except in a very trivial way as a Scot in a UK context. So I have neither personal nor academic credentials on this, and that's kind of the point, in a way, that as long as the conversation is confined to people who have personal or academic insight into it, it doesn't bust out into the mainstream, and it doesn't, just kind of average leaders like me don't see it as their issue. And I think, things only really change when people like me, who don't have any particular things to say about it, say, okay, but I want to be part of this conversation, because as a leader, this is my responsibility. I need to be learning here. I need to be listening here. I need to be looking for the action. I need to be working in collaboration. I need to be spending my time on this. I need to my staff to hear me talking about this. I need people to understand that I care about it and take it seriously. It's on my agenda as a leader. And, I'm here. I'm up for it. I'm in the game. And I think, in a way, you just need more people willing to engage and move on. I've learned a huge amount just by listening and learning and talking over the last few years.
And David,
it's a journey for me, and
you've been great. I mean, that's exactly the sort of thing that needs to happen, and it is depressing. You don't just want black people talking all the time about this and nobody else having anything to say about it. So you've led from the front, but I really do think this is a key to it: leadership. This has been the issue around Cressida Dick. Is she really leading the against the sort of canteen culture, or whatever you call it? And I think what's really surprising and disappointing about London, you've got the GLA, you've got a London-wide, you've got a mayor, you have got London institutions, and I'm waiting to see more leadership on the issues of race. More visible leadership. Something that comes out and says, look, we recognise that there's all sorts of positives about diversity, but we've got some real issues we need to tackle. And I don't get that at the moment. I'm not getting from the GLA and other organisations the sort of leadership that David's talking about, bringing it into the conversation, getting everybody talking about it, focusing on some of the problems. That's what we need. And we need some targets. Can we get some London-wide targets to try and close some of these gaps that we can see, to try and reduce the level of unemployed black graduates, for example, to tackle some of these statistics that we've been talking about. And it is surprising, because you'd think that London would have a platform for doing this with the institutions it's got under devolution.
Yeah, no, definitely. Robin's had another point here, and completely wrote that just as you were saying it, and it's like completely backs up exactly what you're saying. Robin saying London represents a major conundrum that Black FE Leadership Group is determined to tackle, preferably in partnership, e.g. with the Mayor's Office, leaders in all sectors, leaders in education especially. We need concerted action. Warm words and EDI policies are no longer enough, and I 100% agree. We're nearly out of time. We've got literally 40 seconds left. Every one of these episodes I've asked a question which I'd love to ask you both, Andy and David. If you could dream and dream big, what would you want to see to address anti-racism in action, particularly in London? Andy, what would you want to see?
I think just what I've just said. I'd like to see somebody really grasping this and taking leadership and saying, right, just as David's just said, this is now our issue for London, and we're going to really make sure that we drive this one home. Not bits and pieces, a sustained campaign that will tackle some of the issues of race that we've talked about. Yeah,
no, thank you, Andy. David, what would you want to see?
I'd like to see it baked into the leadership narratives of anyone at any level, whether they be a senior leader, middle leader, aspiring leader, that this is uncontroversial, and that this is everyone's business, and that this benefits everyone. Anti-racism is not some kind of amelioration to try and benefit one group. Actually, everybody benefits from a more civil, civic, fair, equitable society. It's as good for white people as for black people. It's absolutely shouldn't be controversial, and it shouldn't be awkward, and yet it still is very, very awkward. The awkwardness of the conversation, and we'll never get past the awkwardness unless we just keep talking, keep making mistakes, keep correcting each other civilly on our mistakes, keep learning, and that's what I'd like to see. And I think we're starting that, and we need to accelerate it.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think Stella will ask me never to dodge that question, but I think you made an interesting point there, David. I think for my dream, I want this to no longer be an awkward conversation, where this is just everyone can just chat about this openly, and everyone can learn. And this, if we're looking at it, London, it's just 32 colleges. That ain't many. It's a lot, but it isn't many to actually look to address. If you can address that in 10%, that's like 3.2, that's not many, like what can we do to address that? And also training providers and awarding organizations, how can we make a change? Guys, thank you so much for joining us today. So you made an awkward conversation unawkward, so thank you. And I think that's the start of this journey, and I think it's London is incredibly important and is obviously close to everyone's heart, and I think it's how can we then address what should be something which seems so obvious to be able to fix, but is so not, and I think everyone coming together as a collective can do that. Thank you, everyone who's joined us today. I hope you really, really enjoyed this episode. And if you're watching this live or on catch up, I hope this has inspired you to try to make positive change, to make action. This is a complete and utter collaboration between FE News and the Black FE Leadership Group. So thank you to everyone who's been involved in bringing this show together. Andy and David, thank you. Robin, I'm so sorry that you can come connect properly. Robin said one more point. I'd like to see more leaders walking the talk rather than more hand wringing. So I've done a bit of hand wringing myself just then, right, Robin, to be honest with you, but I think it's just that, come on, we could do this. And Robin, I'm sorry that we had connectivity issues and stuff like that. But thank you, everyone, for joining us today. See you again next week. We'll be looking at anti-racism in action again. We just need to keep having these conversations, and hopefully, hand wringing, hopefully this won't be awkward come end of the season, that we can all together come to try to make action and positive change. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Bye.